I stood at my kitchen window, watching in disbelief as Kenneth Morrison, the HOA president, directed a crew to install a massive chain-link fence directly across my century-old ranch trail. The same trail my grandfather had used to move cattle for 60 years, the same path that was legally documented in my property deed as a permanent easement. Kenneth stood there in his pristine khaki shorts and polo shirt, clipboard in hand, pointing and gesturing like he was orchestrating some grand symphony of neighborhood improvement. His smug expression made my blood boil as he supervised the workers driving fence posts deep into the ground that had been in my family for generations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail as I watched my neighbor, Frank, approach Kenneth with obvious concern. Frank had been using this trail for his morning jogs for 15 years, and now he stood there, hands on his hips, clearly confused about the sudden blockade. Kenneth waved him off dismissively, his voice carrying across the quiet morning air as he explained that the trail was now private HOA property and that certain residents had been abusing their privileges. I knew exactly which resident he meant. Me, the guy who had dared to question his ridiculous new landscaping requirements at last month's board meeting. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor Tom. "Dude, are you seeing this? Kenneth just told me you're banned from using the trail because you're not in compliance with HOA regulations." I read the message twice, my hands trembling slightly with a mixture of rage and disbelief. This wasn't just about a trail anymore. This was Kenneth flexing his power, showing the entire neighborhood that he could take away something that legally belonged to me, something that had been in my family since before this suburban development even existed. As I watched the crew continue their work, I noticed Kenneth pull out his phone and start recording a video, probably for his social media where he loved to brag about his community improvements. He had no idea that I was recording him too, documenting every moment of his illegal land grab from my kitchen window. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a man so drunk on his tiny slice of power that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, and he was filming it himself. I took a deep breath and allowed myself a small smile as I continued recording. Kenneth Morrison thought he was untouchable, thought his little HOA presidency made him some kind of neighborhood dictator. He had absolutely no idea what was coming his way, no clue about the resources at my disposal or the legal battle he had just started. As I watched him strut around my family's trail like he owned it, I couldn't help but think about how satisfying it would be when he finally realized he had picked a fight with the wrong person. Kenneth, my friend, you just sealed your own fate, and you don't even know it yet. Kenneth Morrison had transformed from a quiet accountant into a power-hungry neighborhood tyrant the moment he was elected HOA president 18 months ago. At 52 years old, he stood barely 5'6", but carried himself like he was running a Fortune 500 company instead of a suburban homeowners association. His perfectly manicured lawn served as a shrine to his obsession with control, complete with measuring tape marks to ensure his grass maintained the exact 2.5-inch height requirement he had personally added to the HOA bylaws. Every morning at precisely 7 a.m., Kenneth would emerge from his beige stucco house wearing his unofficial uniform, pressed khaki shorts, a polo shirt embroidered with HOA President in gold letters, and a clipboard that never left his side. He would begin his daily patrol of the neighborhood, armed with his phone camera and a measuring tape, documenting every perceived violation with the dedication of a detective investigating a murder case. Mrs. Patterson's rosebush was 3 inches too tall. The Johnson family's mailbox was the wrong shade of black, and Mr. Chin's holiday decorations stayed up 2 days past the arbitrary deadline Kenneth had established. The power had clearly gone to his head, and Kenneth relished every opportunity to remind residents who was in charge. He had instituted weekly compliance meetings where he would lecture homeowners about infractions while sitting behind a folding table like some kind of suburban judge. His voice would take on a condescending tone as he explained the importance of community standards and how certain individuals seemed to think the rules didn't apply to them. He would lean back in his plastic chair, fingers steepled, enjoying the discomfort of his neighbors who had been summoned to account for crimes like having the wrong color doormat. Kenneth's harassment tactics had evolved from simple fines to psychological warfare over the past year. He had recruited a network of neighborhood informants, mostly retired men with too much time on their hands, who would report on their neighbors' activities. He installed security cameras pointed toward other people's properties, claiming they were for community safety. He would show up at residents' doors with official-looking letters threatening legal action over the most trivial matters, always accompanied by his loyal sidekick, Gary, a wannabe tough guy who served as Kenneth's unofficial enforcer. The breaking point for many residents came when Kenneth started targeting families with children, claiming their toys and bicycles were unsightly and violated the association's aesthetic standards. He would send formal violation notices to parents whose kids left chalk drawings on their own driveways, and he actually fined the Martinez family because their 8-year-old son's treehouse was not architecturally consistent with the neighborhood's design standards. Kenneth seemed to genuinely believe that his position as HOA president gave him unlimited authority over his neighbors' lives, and he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. "I've built something special here, and I won't let anyone destroy the vision I have for this community." Kenneth's biggest mistake came on a Tuesday morning when he decided to take his power trip to an entirely new level. Not content with simply blocking my ranch trail, he had spent the previous week researching property records and discovered what he thought was a loophole that would allow him to claim the trail as HOA common area. Armed with this misguided confidence, Kenneth called an emergency board meeting without proper notice and railroaded through a vote to reclaim the trail for the betterment of the community. What he didn't realize was that his rushed research had missed several crucial legal documents, including the original easement agreement and my family's mineral rights that extended far beyond the trail itself. The morning after his illegal vote, Kenneth arrived at my property with a crew of workers and what appeared to be a forged work order from the county. He had somehow convinced these men that he had legal authority to not only fence off the trail, but to install gates that would require HOA permission to access. As I watched from my window, I saw him directing the workers to dig post holes directly through areas that contained underground utility lines, a violation that could result in massive fines and potential criminal charges. Kenneth was so focused on his power play that he was ignoring basic safety protocols and legal requirements, creating liability issues that would soon come back to haunt him. But Kenneth wasn't finished with his spectacular display of poor judgment. Around noon, I watched in amazement as he personally climbed over my fence and began spray painting orange X marks on several of my oak trees, claiming they were dead or diseased and needed to be removed for community safety. These were healthy, century-old trees that provided shade for half my property, and Kenneth had absolutely no legal authority to mark them for removal. Even worse, he was trespassing on private property and vandalizing my trees with paint that would permanently damage their bark. The final straw came when Kenneth convinced his buddy Gary to help him install a large sign at the trail entrance that read, "Private HOA property. And no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." Not only was this factually incorrect, but Kenneth had failed to obtain the required permits for the sign installation, and he had placed it partially on county right-of-way property. As I continued documenting his activities, I realized that Kenneth had just committed multiple violations of county ordinances, state property laws, and possibly federal regulations regarding easement interference. What Kenneth didn't know was that my afternoon phone calls weren't just to my lawyer. I was also speaking with the county planning department, the utility companies whose lines he had damaged, and the state environmental agency about his unauthorized tree marking. Every illegal action he took that day was being documented, photographed, and reported to the appropriate authorities. Kenneth Morrison thought he was consolidating his power and teaching me a lesson about challenging his authority, but instead he was building a case against himself that would ultimately lead to his complete downfall. This trail belongs to the HOA now, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. What Kenneth Morrison didn't know about me could fill a book, but the most important detail was my background as a retired corporate attorney specializing in property law and municipal regulations. For 25 years, I had built a career dismantling exactly the kind of illegal power grabs that Kenneth was attempting, and I had maintained relationships with judges, county officials, and regulatory agencies throughout the region. While Kenneth saw a quiet rancher who seemed like an easy target, He was actually picking a fight with someone who understood the legal system better than he could possibly imagine. My first step was to pull every document related to the original ranch property, dating back to the 1890s when my great-grandfather first acquired the land. The trail Kenneth was trying to claim wasn't just a path. It was a legally recorded easement that had been grandfathered into every subsequent property development in the area. I had copies of surveys, mineral rights documents, water rights agreements, and environmental assessments that clearly establish my family's permanent legal claim to the trail. More importantly, I discovered that the HOA's own founding documents specifically acknowledged and protected this easement, meaning Kenneth's board vote was not only illegal, but violated the association's own governing charter. While Kenneth was busy playing dictator, I was quietly building relationships with his victims throughout the neighborhood. Tom Bradley had been fined $3,000 for his non-compliant mailbox, even though it was identical to every other mailbox in the development. Steve Wilson had received violation notices for his lawn being inconsistently maintained despite hiring the same landscaping company Kenneth used. Marcus Rodriguez had been threatened with legal action because his teenage son's basketball hoop was allegedly creating a safety hazard. Each of these men was eager to share their documentation of Kenneth's harassment, and together we were building a comprehensive case of abuse of power and selective enforcement. My secret weapon, however, was my relationship with the county planning commissioner, James Patterson, who had been a colleague of mine for over a decade. James had been receiving complaints about Kenneth's unauthorized fence installation and was already preparing to launch an investigation when I contacted him with additional evidence. The county had very strict rules about interfering with recorded easements, and Kenneth's actions potentially violated multiple ordinances that carried both civil and criminal penalties. James assured me that the county would be taking swift action, and he suggested I also contact the state attorney general's office about potential HOA abuse violations. The most satisfying part of building my case was discovering that Kenneth had been falsifying HOA financial records to cover his unauthorized expenditures on his personal vendetta projects. The fence installation, the signage, and the worker fees were all being charged to the HOA's maintenance budget without proper board approval or homeowner notification. This wasn't just abuse of power, it was embezzlement and fraud. As I compiled the evidence over the following weeks, I realized that Kenneth Morrison had committed enough violations to face serious legal consequences, and he had absolutely no idea that his world was about to come crashing down around him. Kenneth has no idea he's been digging his own grave with every illegal action he takes. The monthly HOA meeting on the third Thursday of October was supposed to be Kenneth's moment of triumph, where he would officially announce his successful reclamation of the ranch trail and present his vision for converting it into a private walking path for compliant residents only. Kenneth had spent weeks preparing his presentation, complete with PowerPoint slides showing before and after photos of his fence installation and detailed plans for his proposed trail improvements. He arrived early that evening, setting up his laptop and projector with the confidence of a man who believed he had just pulled off the greatest power move in HOA history. The community center was packed that night with more residents than had attended any meeting in Kenneth's presidency. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood about the trail controversy, and people were curious to hear Kenneth's explanation for his recent actions. Kenneth seemed energized by the large turnout, interpreting it as validation of his leadership rather than the gathering storm it actually represented. He opened the meeting with his usual self-congratulatory remarks about maintaining community standards and taking decisive action when necessary. When Kenneth clicked to his first slide showing the newly installed fence, I stood up from the back of the room and politely requested permission to address the board. Kenneth's face immediately tightened with annoyance, but parliamentary procedure required him to allow resident comments during the appropriate segment of the meeting. As I walked to the front of the room, carrying my briefcase and a large manila envelope, I could see Kenneth's confidence beginning to waver. He clearly hadn't expected any organized opposition to his carefully orchestrated presentation. I began by thanking Kenneth for his thorough documentation of his activities, then calmly explained to the assembled residents that I had spent the past month conducting my own investigation into the legality of the trail closure. The room fell silent as I pulled out the original property surveys from the 1890s, the recorded easement documents, and the HOA's own founding charter that explicitly protected the trail access. Kenneth's face went pale as I methodically dismantled every legal justification he had used for his actions, explaining in simple terms how he had violated multiple county ordinances, state property laws, and the association's own governing documents. But the real shock came when I revealed the financial records showing that Kenneth had spent over $12,000 of HOA funds on his personal vendetta without proper authorization or board approval. I had obtained these records through a formal request to the HOA's management company, and they clearly showed Kenneth had been falsifying expense reports and manipulating the budget to cover his illegal activities. The room erupted in angry murmurs as residents realized their association fees had been used to fund Kenneth's power trip. Gary, Kenneth's loyal sidekick, quietly slipped out the back door as the evidence mounted against his boss. The final blow came when I announced that the county planning department had issued a formal cease and desist order requiring Kenneth to remove the fence within 48 hours or face criminal charges for easement interference. I also revealed that the state attorney general's office had opened an investigation into HOA financial irregularities and that Kenneth could face embezzlement charges. As I returned to my seat, Kenneth sat frozen at the front of the room, his carefully prepared presentation forgotten, staring at the wreckage of his once unshakable authority. The truth has a way of coming to light, Kenneth, and tonight the entire neighborhood can see exactly what kind of leader you really are. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was swift and devastating for Kenneth Morrison. Within 24 hours, the county planning department arrived with heavy equipment to remove the illegal fence, charging Kenneth personally for the removal costs since the HOA board had voted to distance themselves from his unauthorized actions. The local newspaper picked up the story after several residents contacted them about the meeting, running a front-page article titled, HOA President Faces Criminal Charges in Property Dispute, that included Kenneth's photo and detailed his various legal violations. By the end of the week, Kenneth's world had completely collapsed. The state attorney general's office had frozen the HOA's accounts pending their investigation, and Kenneth was facing potential felony charges for embezzlement and fraud. His employer, a mid-sized accounting firm, suspended him without pay after learning about the criminal investigation, citing concerns about his professional judgment and ethical standards. The local bar association, where Kenneth had somehow convinced people he had legal expertise despite never attending law school, banned him from their premises after discovering he had been dispensing unauthorized legal advice to HOA members. The county prosecutor, Maria Santos, was particularly interested in Kenneth's case because it represented a pattern of HOA abuse that her office had been tracking across the region. She filed charges not only for the financial crimes, but also for criminal trespass, vandalism of my oak trees, and interference with recorded property easements. The environmental agency added their own charges related to Kenneth's unauthorized tree marking, and the utility companies joined the case seeking damages for the underground lines his fence installation had damaged. Kenneth's attempts to defend himself only made things worse. He hired a lawyer with his dwindling savings, but his attorney quickly realized that Kenneth had documented his own crimes so thoroughly that a defense was nearly impossible. Kenneth had saved copies of all his threatening letters to residents, kept detailed records of his illegal expenditures, and even had photos on his phone showing him spray painting my trees. His obsession with documentation, which he had thought made him look professional and thorough, had created an ironclad case against him. The final humiliation came when Kenneth was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week he had illegally blocked my trail. The local news cameras were there to capture Kenneth being led away in handcuffs, still wearing his ridiculous HOA president polo shirt. His mugshot became a social media sensation, shared thousands of times with captions mocking power-hungry HOA officials. Kenneth Morrison, who had spent 18 months terrorizing his neighbors and believing himself untouchable, was now facing years in prison and complete financial ruin. The community celebrated that evening with an impromptu block party in the park, where residents shared stories about Kenneth's abuse and toasted his downfall. Several neighbors approached me to thank me for taking him down, but I reminded them that Kenneth had really defeated himself through his own arrogance and illegal actions. As I walked home along my newly reopened ranch trail, I couldn't help but smile at the poetic justice of it all. Kenneth spent so much time documenting everyone else's violations that he created a perfect record of his own crimes. 6 months after Kenneth's arrest, our neighborhood had transformed into something completely different from the fear-based dictatorship he had created. The HOA board, now composed of reasonable men who actually wanted to serve their community rather than control it, had voted to drastically reduce the number of restrictive rules and focus on genuine community improvement projects. Tom Bradley was elected as the new president, running on a platform of common-sense governance, and promising to never again allow one person to wield the kind of power Kenneth had abused. The legal aftermath continued to unfold in Kenneth's disfavor throughout the spring and summer. He ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 3 years in state prison, with an additional 5 years of probation, during which he was prohibited from serving on any HOA board or homeowner association. The judge, during sentencing, specifically mentioned that Kenneth's case would serve as a warning to other power-hungry HOA officials who might think they were above the law. Kenneth was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and to the individual residents he had harassed, including covering all legal fees. My ranch trail became something of a neighborhood landmark, with many residents making a point to walk or jog along the historic path that Kenneth had tried so hard to steal. The County Historical Society even installed a small plaque commemorating the trail's significance in the area's ranching heritage, noting that it had been preserved through the dedicated efforts of concerned citizens. Tom Bradley suggested we name it the Justice Trail in honor of how it had been saved, but I preferred to keep its original name. Some victories speak for themselves without needing monuments. The new HOA board invited me to serve as their legal advisor, a position I accepted on the condition that we would focus on protecting residents' rights rather than restricting them. We established new policies requiring board transparency, homeowner approval for any expenditure over $500, and mandatory legal review of any rule changes. Most importantly, we created a resident advocate position specifically designed to prevent the kind of abuse Kenneth had inflicted on our community. On a quiet Sunday morning in late summer, I was sitting on my back porch with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the trail that Kenneth had tried to steal from me. My neighbor Steve Wilson stopped by during his morning jog to update me on Kenneth's latest legal troubles. Apparently, he was facing additional charges in another county where he had served on a different HOA board years earlier. As Steve continued his run along the trail, I reflected on how Kenneth's arrogance and illegal actions had ultimately made our community stronger and more united than it had ever been. The irony wasn't lost on me that Kenneth Morrison, in his desperate attempt to demonstrate his power and control, had actually created the conditions for his own complete destruction while simultaneously bringing our neighborhood together in ways we never could have imagined. Sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing someone to reveal their true character to the world, then stepping back and letting justice take its natural course. Kenneth taught our entire community an invaluable lesson about the difference between leadership and tyranny, though I doubt he intended to be such an effective teacher. 2 years after Kenneth's downfall, our neighborhood had become a model community that other HOAs actually visited to learn about effective self-governance and resident rights protection. The story of Kenneth Morrison's spectacular fall from power had spread throughout the region, becoming a cautionary tale shared at municipal government conferences and community leadership seminars. Local real estate agents even used our reformed HOA as a selling point, advertising homes in our development as being in a resident-friendly community with transparent governance. Kenneth himself had been released from prison after serving 18 months of his sentence, but his life bore no resemblance to the comfortable suburban existence he had once enjoyed. His house had been foreclosed during his incarceration, his wife had divorced him and moved to another state, and he was working at a convenience store in a neighboring town under a manager who was roughly half his age. The accounting firm had not only fired him, but had also reported him to professional licensing boards, ensuring he would never work in finance again. The personal satisfaction I felt wasn't about Kenneth's suffering. It was about the positive changes his absence had brought to our community. The new HOA board had used the settlement money from Kenneth's restitution to fund genuinely beneficial projects. A community garden, improved street lighting, and a small playground that brought families together rather than driving them apart. Children played in yards without fear of violation notices. Neighbors helped each other with home improvement projects. And the weekly HOA meetings had become friendly gatherings where residents actually enjoyed participating in community decisions. My ranch trail had become a symbol of something larger than just property rights. It represented the principle that communities thrive when residents' legitimate interests are protected rather than when they live in fear of arbitrary authority. The county had even extended the trail system to connect with regional hiking paths, creating recreational opportunities that benefited the entire area. Local schools brought classes to learn about the area's ranching history, and my property had become an unofficial educational site where children could connect with their community's heritage. On the second anniversary of Kenneth's arrest, Tom Bradley organized a community barbecue in the park to celebrate what he called Independence Day, the day our neighborhood had freed itself from tyrannical rule. As I looked around at families enjoying themselves, neighbors laughing together, and children playing without supervision, I realized that Kenneth's greatest failure had been his inability to understand that real community leadership comes from service, not power. His legacy would be remembered not for the fear he created, but for the strength and unity that emerged after his removal. The best communities are built on trust and mutual respect, values that Kenneth never understood but inadvertently taught us to cherish. As I write this story 5 years after Kenneth Morrison's reign of terror, I'm sitting in the same kitchen where I first watched him illegally fence off my family's historic trail. The view has changed considerably. The trail is now marked with attractive wooden signs indicating its historical significance, and there's a small rest area with benches where neighbors often stop to chat during their walks. The fence posts Kenneth installed are long gone, but the lessons learned from a spectacular downfall continue to shape our community's approach to governance and neighborly relations. Kenneth's story has become something of a legend in HOA circles throughout our state, often referenced in legal seminars and community leadership training as an example of how quickly unchecked power can corrupt and destroy. The state legislature even passed new laws strengthening homeowner protections and requiring additional oversight of HOA financial activities, legislation that was directly inspired by Kenneth's case and others like it. His name appears in legal textbooks as a cautionary example, ensuring that future HOA board members will understand the serious consequences of abusing their positions. What strikes me most about the entire experience is how Kenneth's downfall was ultimately inevitable given his character and actions. He wasn't brought down by some elaborate revenge scheme or complex legal maneuvering. He was destroyed by his own arrogance, his own illegal actions, and his own inability to understand that real authority comes from serving others rather than controlling them. My role was simply to document his crimes and ensure that the appropriate authorities were aware of his violations. Kenneth Morrison defeated himself through his own choices and character flaws. The trail incident taught our entire community valuable lessons about the importance of standing up to bullies, the power of documentation and legal knowledge, and the difference between leadership and tyranny. Many residents have told me that watching Kenneth comeuppance inspired them to become more involved in local government and community affairs, understanding that passive acceptance of abuse only enables more abuse. Our neighborhood is now more engaged, more informed, and more protective of individual rights than it ever was before Kenneth's brief but destructive presidency. Today, as I watch my neighbor's grandchildren playing on the trail that Kenneth tried to steal, I'm reminded that the best revenge against petty tyrants is simply ensuring that their victims are protected and that justice is served. Kenneth Morrison spent 18 months terrorizing his neighbors and believing himself untouchable. But his legacy is a stronger, more united community that will never again allow one person to wield such destructive power. Sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones where justice prevails naturally, without requiring anything more than patience, documentation, and faith in the legal system. Have you ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA president? Share your story in the comments. And remember, bullies like Kenneth Morrison always eventually defeat themselves through their own actions. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of greed, abuse of authority, and revenge against those who misuse power. Its purpose is to raise awareness about toxic community control, provoke thought about fairness and accountability, and inspire conversations about standing up to corruption and reclaiming justice.